This is Invested in Climate with Jason Rissman. I see climate as the world's biggest, most diverse, most important movement in human history. Millions of people dedicate themselves every day to protecting the planet. This podcast shares conversations with advocates, entrepreneurs, investors, policy experts, and anyone else that can push our thinking about what's possible and what needs to happen to address climate change. If you have ideas for episodes or feedback, get in touch on LinkedIn. If you enjoy the show, please leave a rating on Apple or Spotify. I'm currently building a new venture. It's related to storytelling and how we engage all sorts of folks in meaningful climate action. If you have expertise in this area, big ideas, or examples of something that's really working, get in touch. Thanks for listening and for doing whatever it is you're doing to support climate progress. Okay, let's get started.
Foundations can lead movements. They're not by their nature and not by law political with a capital P, but they can provide funding for the things that movements need: communications, data, the ability to communicate, the ability to build power starting locally, address local issues, onboard people, connect them.
Hi, everyone. In this series on climate philanthropy, I'm exploring the wide range of ways that foundations are stepping up to support climate progress, especially amidst federal rollbacks and inconsistent commitment from large companies. Philanthropic capital is tiny in comparison to government and corporate budgets, but it can still be a helpful tool, especially if wielded strategically. Let's set some context. In the United States, there are over 30,000 environmental nonprofits. It's a wildly diverse field with organizations of all sizes and countless focus areas. Since the 1970s, they've literally saved millions of lives through environmental protections that have cleaned our air, water, land, buildings, factories, products, and more. Many are struggling with funding cuts and staff shortages, and too often they compete for attention and resources. Foundations play a critical role in funding these organizations, but they can also play a more fundamental role, building movement infrastructure that bolsters the power and influence of the entire field. That, argues Pisces Foundation President David Beckman, is a priority that deserves more attention and support. David is a friend who I've had the pleasure of working with over the years. When it comes to thinking about and investing in movement infrastructure, I can't think of anyone else who brings the nuance and insight David has gained through a career-long focus on advancing the environmental movement. We talk about his background as an NRDC attorney early in his career, his role in helping start the Pisces Foundation, the entrepreneurial nature of his work, what movement infrastructure is, what he's learned about investing in it, the importance of late-night cookies and building relationships, the need for a meta-narrative, the work of the Pisces Foundation, super pollutants, what business people and young people should know about the environmental movement, and much more. This was a delightfully insightful conversation that'll push your thinking. Enjoy. Hey, David, great to see you. Thank you for joining Invested in Climate.
Great to be here, Jason.
I've really been looking forward to this interview. You and I always have great conversations, and I know it'll be fun to get to step back for a minute and reflect together.
For sure. Looking forward to it.
All right, well, let's do it. Let's first learn a bit about you. You are the president of the Pisces Foundation, and you've been in that role for 12 years. Tell us about the work that you did prior to Pisces and what got you involved in the environmental movement in the first place.
Yeah, Jason, and particularly for your audience, I would say that what ties my work together is advocacy and something of a social entrepreneurial bent. And the entrepreneurial bent, I didn't really set out and didn't conceive of myself in that way. But over the years, in nonprofit context, I've started a lot of programs and now I've had the good fortune of being able to start a number of different initiatives, which I think are very much like startups. They're social sector startups and they return social value as opposed to direct pecuniary value for the founders and the investors. But I started as a lawyer. I worked at a law firm for a couple of years and realized I didn't want to practice corporate law. And I got a job at NRDC, which is a great environmental NGO. And I spent almost 20 years there. I worked my way up to running a big program nationally and then had the good fortune. I consider myself an accidental philanthropist because I had the good fortune of meeting Bob Fisher and then Randy Fisher. And when I was going to leave NRDC, one thing led to another, and we started the Pisces Foundation together. I've gone from being kind of a line advocate and a lawyer doing courtroom litigation for environmental justice, water kinds of issues, and so on, to funding that kind of work. And I've had a lot of chance to think about how does social change happen. And I've learned a lot. I've realized over time what I didn't know. And I probably don't know now either, but at least I'm evolving toward things I think might be more effective.
Well, really fascinating to think that in some ways you've had two pretty significant chapters and they were quite distinct. But also interesting that not only do you lead the Pisces Foundation, but you helped found it. Tell us about the process of developing its initial focus and strategy.
Yeah, well, we put the foundation together like from the proverbial napkin around the table. And on my first day, it was me by myself in an office. I don't even think I had a laptop. I remember with one of our first hires walking down Market Street with Apple computers like slung under our arms. But what was great is being able to start with a clean sheet enabled me and our trustees to really think about what our experience had been in environmental and climate advocacy in various ways. They were board members in different organizations. And I did the work and then managed big programs. We really looked hard and we had some great help, worked with a firm called Redstone, answer like what were the biggest problems? And specifically, what were the issues where there had been, just as there are in the economy, a mismatch between the opportunity and the funding. And in the case of environmental issues, the mismatch would be a really important problem or a really big opportunity that for one reason or another didn't get the philanthropic funding, didn't get the attention that it deserved. And that's how we ended up with 3 programs: environmental education, really about how do you make the next generation, how do you equip the next generation to make fact-based decisions about the environment? How do you create equal access to nature with all those benefits? Water in the US, a hugely important issue that touches us all. We're all made of water mostly, and its quality and quantity are essential for our lives and our economy for that matter. And then climate, and there we focused on the non-CO2 pollutants. Many people know that CO2 is a critical issue probably, but there are these non-carbon super pollutants like methane, exhaust, black carbon, and other chemicals that are contributing about half of current warming and are really critical to control. And that's where we put our focus because there had been virtually no philanthropic funding in that area 10 years ago.
David, really excited to circle back and talk about all of those. And we'll for sure talk about climate and super pollutants as well as the other themes. Before we go there, let's provide some context. Having been a leader in the environmental movement for so long, you have a great perspective, not just on your own organization, but also on the field itself. How would you describe the state of the environmental movement today?
That's a great question. And we're recording this on a Friday afternoon. We could talk till Sunday, probably about that answer. And I promise I won't. But I would say a couple of things. One, I think that the current situation in the country is not a good indicator of the strength of the environmental movement, meaning all the repeals that are occurring reflect elections that could have turned out differently with not a huge swing of votes. So I think that's true. But at the same time, my own experience, particularly in the last 10 years, Jason, as I got an opportunity to see more and to think more, as I wasn't just doing my cases, I wasn't just figuring out what the next legal brief was, is that over the last 20 years at least, the environmental movement has had a huge success in developing policy to address so many, maybe most of the major issues, policy ideas. There are technical solutions that we have. But what we may have not paid enough attention to is the influence and the power that's necessary to propel any of those to the ground, to implement them, to make them happen, to generate the public support. That, I think, needs correcting now, because by so many measures, we're just not keeping up with the pace and scale of change, notwithstanding the extraordinary efforts. Where would we be without the modern environmental movement, that started in the 1970s? The success of that movement has made everybody's life better, no matter whether you're part of that movement or not. But we need to recharge the battery, so to speak. We need to amp up the power and amp up the influence. And philanthropy's got to support that. That's different than supporting a campaign for a discrete bill or report or film. We need to do a better job at that.
You wrote recently something that caught my eye, that the key priority for the environmental movement is the strength of its strategic posture. And I think that's what you're alluding to of part of the role of philanthropy. And in your words, you said the most important shift we can make is to focus less, relatively speaking, on developing policy and more on policy's prerequisites. influence, and power. We have solutions. We need more sway. Explain this a bit more. How does something as vast and varied as the environmental movement strengthen its influence and power?
The environmental movement, I think, is discernible in one way and it's elusive in another. And maybe that's what you're getting at. So I think that when you think about the Sierra Club or other organizations, that many people would say, oh yeah, those are environmentalists. That's the environmental movement. But movements are not just professional organizations, and they're not just people who think every day like I do about environmental issues. They're real people who have all sorts of concerns and all sorts of things that they want to see happen. But what we can do, and what successful movements in history on the left and the right can do, is build in specific ways towards specific goals. And the way they do that often is through support through their supporters. Foundations can't lead movements. They're not by their nature and not by law political with a capital P, but they can provide funding for the things that movements need: communications, data, the ability to communicate, the ability to build power starting locally, address local issues, onboard people, connect them. You see that in so many successful movements in this country, whether it's tobacco 20, 25 years ago, whether it's marriage equality 10 or 15 years ago. And you see it on the political right. The movement building that's been done on the political right has been impressive. I mean, I don't mean impressive like I necessarily in my personal life subscribe to it, but from the perspective of aggregating power and using it, it's impressive. And we can do that. We did it before, but we need to be oriented toward those sorts of investments.
Let's talk more about aggregating power. You also wrote recently in the New York Times about the importance of collective work for movement infrastructure. And you've argued that the strategic leverage in collectives can be far more influential than individual NGOs. And I'm aware that you're not just leading Pisces, but you're also working through different collaborative field building initiatives, such as Blue Sky Funders Forum and the Mosaic Funder Collaborative. Tell us about those initiatives, the role that they play in environmental field building today, and how you see this issue of collective work.
Yeah, it's one that I've really come to through time and through mistake. In other words, I was a classic example of somebody who thought very tactically. So I was a lawyer. I would bring cases. I brought cases on polluted runoff. I brought cases regarding environmental justice, supporting environmental justice organizations. All of that is important, but what needs to sit on top of it is a meta strategy that is big enough and scaled enough to meet the scale of the problem. The problem in terms of pollution, in terms of climate change, is vast. And so the notion that even the biggest environmental group, maybe 500 or 1,000 people, is somehow at the right scale to address essentially the pollution created by certain economic decisions, meta economic decisions, or the political economy of the United States is just foolish. Of course, that's not the case. But we tend to fund individual organizations. We don't have a lot of mechanisms for funding broader collectives. That's a critical problem. That's a mismatch between what the moment needs and what philanthropy provides. And I'm not saying that philanthropy doesn't do any of that. I'm saying it needs to do more of it. So efforts like Mosaic, the Blue Sky Funders Forum, just as a couple examples, attempt to address that. So Mosaic brings together a diverse set of field leaders, not philanthropy per se, and equips them with the money to make their own investment decisions in terms of what they need. They're a fractal of the environmental movement. Big NGOs, environmental justice organizations, and so on, including some that are on the center right, not just the left, as sometimes people think about these sorts of things. So that's an effort to equip organizations to work together, to recognize that coordination is not frictionless or free, and somebody has to pay for it, and foundations can do that. The Blue Sky Funders Forum is an environmental education-focused effort. Environmental education falls through the cracks between the environment funding on the one hand and education funding on the other. And this was an effort that we put together, and one of our trustees, Randy Fisher, was very instrumental in order to bring together funders who were funding like parallel play, kids with parallel play. They were doing the same thing, but they weren't doing it together. And it's an effort that now has over 100 different funding entities engaged who are thinking about what does a collective strategy look like? Or how can we be a symphony? Maybe we're not all playing the same instruments in the same way, but we want to think about how it all goes together. And that's spun off some really valuable infrastructure like narratives. There's a Rethink Outside narrative that came out of that effort that equips all sorts of organizations to adapt that sophisticated communications product and to use it in ways that small organizations would never be able to afford on their own.
Definitely want to circle back to narratives, but let me ask you just about, you mentioned before, being a social entrepreneur, which isn't necessarily the expected job description for someone that's leading a foundation. But I know from having been working with you while you were setting up one of these collaboratives that it actually puts someone in a philanthropy in an interesting position where, on the one hand, you're investing in all sorts of great work and great causes. And on the other hand, you're actually fundraising. You're trying to move dollars and try to recruit other supporters for a common cause. Tell me about that process of having to sort of flip the switch and go from being the investor or the donor to then also being a fundraiser at the same time.
One of the reasons that I thought it would be interesting to work on a philanthropy is because I had such significant fundraising obligations when I was at NRDC. So I know, even a larger organization, how critical funders are, whether they should be or not. And you're right, when you run a philanthropy, at least the kind that with the attitude that we have, which is that we want to lean into the work, you're also fundraising, but not with the same, frankly, stress that I don't want to equate the two. They're not the same because I'm not fundraising in order to pay, my team, for example, keep from layoffs is a different thing. But I think what I've learned when I was fundraising for programs, I try to channel now, which is, what's the value proposition? Why should somebody join this effort? How do we adopt an attitude of what Larry Kramer, who's a friend of mine and ran the Hewlett Foundation, called diffuse reciprocity, which is a complicated term that just means if something's important to you, Jason, and I can help you because it's important to you, not because it's my strategy. And likewise, if we're in a relationship where that applies, you'll do the same. You apply that to nonprofits who are not in competition, or they're not naturally in competition. We're not creating apps that are competing for the same eyeballs. If that attitude applies, so much more can get done, and you can do things at scale. That's the value, I think, of fundraising when you're giving away money is nobody's got enough money. And the more that can be aggregated, the bigger the projects, the bigger the benefit for the social sector.
David, collaborative field building, of course, takes many forms. What have you learned about what's most effective and also what's elusive yet still feels important to you?
Well, look, I'm no expert. I'm diving into it because I think this is the direction that we need to go to have the best probability of making the biggest impact. That's mine. But it's not easy. And collaboration is, as I said, not frictionless or free. And that's the biggest thing to get past. I think philanthropy has, in some ways, I don't think intentionally, but I think nevertheless has distorted some of the relationships in the social sector by directly or indirectly pitting groups against each other for money. There's not enough of it. And there's some element that I know I felt when I was running a big program of musical chairs. Will I get a seat? That kind of feeling makes me not necessarily want to compete with you if I think you may get the seat that I need. So one of the most important things like that we did with Mosaic, and there was some trial and error, is really focus on relationship. And that can seem, oh, well, what does that really mean? And everyone says, oh, go at the speed of trust, but there's some real truth to it. And the moment that I think Mosaic really took flight was around 11 p.m. outside an Insomnia Cookies in Brooklyn during the first retreat after COVID, when we could actually get together. And I have that mental image, that memory, because what began to happen, as we were coming back from dinner, I think, going back to the hotel or wherever the team was staying, was people began to relate to each other as people. They began to see their common interests. They didn't just show up in this Mosaic governance group as like representatives that were there to extract a portion of, or the biggest portion of, the money. So relationships are, I think, key. They take time and they need to be funded. And I think that's something that we sometimes don't pay enough attention to. The last thing I'd say is that a lot of the investments that you make if you're movement building are harder to see than they are in other types of funding. So, there's no building there at the end of the day. There's nothing tangible sometimes, or not as tangible. So it requires funders to have a different perspective on what impact looks like, a different perspective on the time scale to measure impact, and perhaps an ability to talk to trustees and to others and to bring them along in these new ways of funding. And so those are some things I've learned so far.
I just love the image of standing outside the Insomnia Cookies. People probably would have said that you would say late night at a bar, but instead a bunch of environmentalists outside having cookies.
Well, there was sugar and alcohol. So but yeah, that's just how it happened. And particularly because people, I don't think honestly, didn't go into Mosaic with huge amounts of trust. It was really kind of a breakthrough. And Mosaic really took off from there. There was, of course, much more that led to that moment, but that was a moment.
I remember early on when I had the pleasure of getting to work and think with you a bit on this, is that there was a concern that often at the senior levels of foundations, people pull their punches and don't go to battle with different theories of change. That folks might have a different view of, okay, we're going to focus on methane or we're going to focus on something else. And rather than really try to think it through together, everyone's just respectful and lets each other have their own theories of change. Does that issue continue to come up, or what have you learned about that? Maybe problem or maybe just good opportunity within philanthropy?
Well, I do think that that's common experience, and people have written about it. You've seen it yourself. Philanthropy does an enormous amount of good in this country. It's certainly not perfect. And there's certainly things that it can and should do. And one of them, I think, is this tendency to think within the house, so to speak. Philanthropy has a lot of money, but not enough money to do what needs to be done. The way in which strategies, if they're overly rigid, and work with other strategies, can make a set of foundations less than the whole. We should be looking for 2 + 2 = 5. We should not accept 2 + 2 = 4, or certainly not 2 + 2 = 3. So that kind of flexibility is key. Now, I see in this moment, actually, some softening of that, some recognition, because so many policies that matter to the organizations we support are being gutted, that it is gutting to people. And in that vulnerability is an opportunity, if we take it, to recognize that through united action, through some reassessment and some softening of these boundaries, that we may come up with better strategies that have greater scale. And that doesn't mean we have to do everything the same. It just means that there are certain pieces of work that we have to collectively make sure we're covered. And that's essentially the argument I've been making in the Stanford piece and in the Times. Is it's really not about like, oh, everyone else is wrong, this is the right way to do it. It's saying there are certain prerequisites, and do we cover them adequately? My answer is no, we don't. And we all have a stake in making sure that changes.
David, you brought up narrative. I'd like to circle back to that. And there are probably hundreds of vertical issue-driven segments of the environmental movement, each with their own storytelling strategy, which sometimes support one another and sometimes actually maybe compete with each other. Is there a meta-narrative, something that ties together the environmental movement and helps it capture the hearts and minds of people? What is that narrative and how does it need to improve?
That's the $1 trillion question. I grew up as a lawyer communicating with judges, so I'm probably not the right person to sort of say, well, here's the meta-narrative, Jason. But I'll say a couple of things that are really not my ideas, but that I think are right. So one of the challenges that we have is that the environmental movement is diverse, and it should be. And so there's this concept that I've read about called a polyphonic grand narrative. If you think music, that's the way to think about it. It means that there are several pieces playing at the same time. They overlap. They go together, but they're not the same. I don't think that we have, and I don't think anybody who does this kind of work in environment and climate thinks that we've got that grand narrative. You're implying, and I think correctly, that some of the communications work is just not caught up to the postmodern age. We're just not there. That was true when I was doing the work, and I think it's still true today. Investment in that is the classic commons problem that we've been talking about, meaning that a grand narrative is not going to be owned by any one organization. So by definition, no organization can create it. In fact, if one organization or even a few creates it, the rest are going to say, I wasn't in on that. That's not my thing. This is an example of like, what is the prerequisite to getting to that kind of a narrative? I would argue it is a refocus on what people call movement infrastructure, the tools that advocates use, and also the infrastructure, the connections between those organizations. I do think there's a lot to be said. If environmentalists were talking about the fact that, here's what we stand for. We stand for really inexpensive, super clean energy to do all kinds of cool things. We stand for living longer. There's this whole longevity movement. We stand for living years longer by not burdening your body with all kinds of bad stuff from when you're in the uterus, right? Things like that, I think, are available to us, but too often we get drowned out by very, very sophisticated and very well-funded opponents.
David, I've been reading the book Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. It makes a strong argument that while the environmental movement has made tremendous contributions and has literally saved millions of lives through legal action and advocacy that have cleaned air, water, and land, it has also helped lead to a style of governance that makes it extremely hard to build stuff like housing or factories, which in turn, and I'm oversimplifying this argument, depletes power for the environmental movement because it erodes a vision and a plan for an exciting future. I don't know if you've read the book, but I'm sure you've heard arguments like this before. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, no, I certainly heard about the concept. I haven't read the book. I'm two minds of it. I think, first of all, that the question you just asked relates to this one. I don't think that we have won, that the advocates for environmental issues and climate advocates have not won the communications battle. And I think that's reflected in part in what Ezra Klein and his co-author have written. That is to say that it's very easy to say, well, there's this example of overreach and therefore the whole system is problematic. Of course, there's examples of overreach. There's examples of businesses that are cheating. That doesn't mean that all businesses cheat. But narratives are, like facts on the ground, and we have to deal with them. I would say about some of the arguments around not being able to do things, that I would give you an example from my own work where that really is the counter narrative to that. So when I was a young lawyer, I worked with local community groups in the Bay Area after the big earthquake. So I'm dating myself.
1906?
Yeah. No, I'm not dating myself that much. Yeah, it was 30 years ago, I think, or it was in 89, the Loma Prieta earthquake. Anyway, it was a terrible tragedy. It knocked down a 2-level freeway through West Oakland. You may remember it if you're in the Bay Area. Because of some of the laws that are criticized, NEPA, CEQA, community groups had an opportunity with representation to have a seat at the table, and they were able to get that freeway rebuilt close to the port. That's why there's that big curve if you take the freeway south of the Bay Bridge, out of the middle of their neighborhood. Now, who wouldn't say that's not a good thing? Who wouldn't say that's not creative, inspirational, the future that we want? That comes out of some of the laws that are criticized as overreaching and hamstringing. So it's a complex picture. And I think it's important to make sure that abuses of law, no matter where they come from, are addressed. But I don't think we want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I'll make one other point. Now, this is an analogy. I'm not equating these two things. But we're seeing right now how critical it is in this country that people who the government wants to, say, throw out of the country have a chance to talk to a judge, have that kind of due process. A lot of the environmental laws in a different way, and again, not equating liberty with some of this, but they give people in communities, people in your neighborhood, people in another neighborhood, a listener's neighborhood, a chance to be heard. And I think that is part of a beautiful vision of this country. And I think it's important to maintain that while making sure that we're not squashing everything as a byproduct.
We've been talking pretty big picture. Let's turn back to the work that you're doing. Over the 12 years at Pisces, I'm sure there have been several chapters or different phases with different focus areas. Walk us through the history of the foundation and its strategic evolution.
Well, the foundation comes out of a desire of Randy and Bob Fisher, who are the trustees of the foundation and done tremendous work, to move from institutional relationships, sitting on a board, to addressing problems at a bigger level. And so I think I would say, we've been around for 12 years, so we're no longer the junior kids on the block, although we're a lot earlier in our trajectory than many large foundations in this country. And I think the first stage reflected a lot of funding to larger organizations. It's sort of the earlier part of our work reflects what I learned when I was doing the work at NRDC. And I think the second half of our work continues to value some of those organizations like I used to work at, but also has attempted to fund in a more complete and holistic way. Not only ensuring that our money is going to different types of organizations, including small frontline organizations and community, but also making sure that we are supporting the full range of things that are necessary to shift systems. So that is policy, that is technology, of course, but it is fundamentally today influence, scale, and power. And in the absence of those three, influence, scale, and power, you can have the best policy ideas, the best business plan in the world. You're not going to get the shifts that we need. And so that's how I divide things up. And now in this, what we call our 2.0 phase of the foundation, which we're starting now, we're really centering being a resource to organizations that want to work together to do bigger things. We're still focusing on the environment and climate, and we're opening up a new line of work to improve the city of San Francisco for the people who live here and to ensure that it thrives. And we're taking that same approach. How do we create that scale, that influence to really do the big things that need to be done, as opposed to just funding things that will be marginal and won't keep up with the pace and scale of change?
Let's dig deeper into this idea that you want to fund collaborative work. Is it that you're looking for proposals where folks are applying in collaboration with someone, or in the proposal, it just posits that they might work with someone? How does it actually work in practice in terms of?
Well, our team is working that out now, and we have a great team that's out there and is part of the communities in which we fund. But yeah, I think increasingly what it looks like is a group of organizations coming together, or us reaching out and saying, hey, look, if there is that work that you want to do, and by the way, Jason, that can be the hardest work to fund. So sometimes this is how philanthropy can mold a field. People might not come to you with that because they don't think you're going to fund it. We want people in our community to know that we're open to those kinds of proposals, and we're open to learning with them about how they can work together and how can we provide that kind of resource that they may not have from other types of grants. That fits well also for our foundation in terms of how it works with other foundations. So, if you're a foundation that supports a bunch of different organizations, that's great. That gets them into a position where maybe we can then add some money that allows them to do that next level.
What should listeners know about super pollutants and the effort to combat them?
Yeah, well, they're super in a bad way, not a good way. That's the first thing to know. Climate super pollutants is what you're talking about. And this is something, I frankly didn't know when we started the foundation. So CO2, if you know about climate change, that's a big problem, but it's not the only problem. About half of current warming, best estimates suggest, come from a set of pollutants that are under this label of super climate pollutants. Methane, so from gas and oil, for example. What's called black carbon, which is exhaust from different kind of motor engines, and chemicals that ironically help with cooling, help with air conditioning, called HFCs. And they vary in their power, their warming potential per pound, but they're all way more per pound powerful warmers than is CO2. The sort of mosaic of reduction that we have to get climate to mitigate climate change is a combination of CO2, which has bigger impact over the long haul, and these other pollutants, which can help us in the short haul because they come out of the atmosphere for reasons of physics and other things much more quickly. So that's where we've put our money in climate, is into these pollutants, because they can really help stabilize climate change quicker. And we need to do that. We're really out of time.
You mentioned before environmental education and access to nature as interest areas. Are those things that you're still funding, or was that part of 1.0?
We are still funding, is the short answer. The way we're thinking about it is what shifted. So we had some foundations, or maybe some businesses, we had departments. So we had a couple of people who did environmental education and so on and so forth. Now we're thinking about those areas, but we're really thinking about where can we be impactful in building these large-scale collaboratives to solve big problems in the environment here in San Francisco. It's a shift maybe that's more important from the way we think holistically, but I imagine we will continue to be supporters in each of these areas that we have been working in so far.
David, what's going on in DC? How has it impacted your strategy, the focus of the foundation, and more broadly, how has the role of philanthropy changed in this new political era?
Yeah, well, foundations by their nature, by law, they're not, political with a capital P. We don't support candidates and things like that. We do support with charitable contributions organizations that are pursuing different policies and different outcomes that help people. And the work to undo the Environmental Protection Agency, to undo a lot of the investments in clean energy, which I know is a major topic, the topic of your podcast, are really devastating, and they need to be opposed on their merits, not because one politician is for them or against them, but because they're not good for the country. We and other foundations, I think, need to step up in a couple different ways. This is one of the reasons I wrote the piece I did. So first, we need to fund at greater quantities, and proud that our foundation, our trustees have approved an increase in our budget this year. Foundations, their product is money. That's our product. So we need more of it now, period. Second, we have to, as I've been arguing, think about how we're funding. What are the patterns that are more likely to help the broadest number of organizations now? And I wrote about this in SSIR because right now, environmental funding flows to a smaller set of organizations. 200 organizations out of maybe 20,000 environmental NGOs get 50% of the funding that the Environmental Grantmakers Association provides, which is like a trade group of environmental organizations. That kind of narrow and focused funding is not going to build the scale that we need, and it won't help all these organizations that need help right now. It'll help some. So broadening the way we funding these infrastructural components to allow people to work together, funding common narratives, common tools, because there's not enough money to fund everything everybody needs in a bespoke way, one at a time. Those are critical pieces of, I think, what it means to stand up right now. I think philanthropy is coming together in ways I haven't seen before.
Many of our listeners come from the business community. What should they know about the environmental movement and philanthropy?
I think the environmental movement and philanthropy are different and not. I think a lot of the business opportunities that you focus on and your listeners may be working on are direct outcomes of the success of the environmental movement and the advocacy of groups in the past, but also over the last 5 or 10 years. And so I think there's a real connection between what's possible, what kinds of markets are created, and what the social sector can do to advance not business interests per se, but the vision of the country that involves clean energy, involves clean water and clean air. I found, interestingly enough, working as a lawyer for business and early in my career, that a lot of the way environmental NGOs think, a lot of their growth is not that different from business. That is to say, I think entrepreneurial instincts that build nonprofits are not that fundamentally different from those that build business. Now, we're working with different tools, maybe the clay's a little different, whatever you want to say, but I think there's a lot of overlap. And there are a lot of people I know who have gone from nonprofit careers into B Corps or into different types of climate startups. Maybe less so the other direction, but I don't think that it's impossible to go the other direction.
Talking about careers, let's talk about young people. There's, as we know, a lot of young people entering the workforce who care a lot about the environment and the world in which they will get to live their lives. What advice can you offer them?
I would start with something that's really, really means a lot to me. It's a piece that Rebecca Solnit wrote. Maybe we can put it in the show notes. About 8 years, but she could have written it yesterday. And what she says is essentially that hope is an antidote or a middle space between the optimists on the one hand and the pessimists on the other. The optimists assume everything's going to work out. The pessimists think it's all going to go to hell in a handbasket. But in that space in the middle is possibility. And in that possibility of action is hope. And that's what I think about. That's what I like to tell our team to think about is where are those opportunities? There are a lot of them. And I think I have young kids, teenagers and one going to college. I think that this is a moment where you need to recognize those possibilities are there and to put your energy into them, not in a Pollyannish way and not in a way that is overly negative that assumes nothing can be shifted. Big things do shift. Social movements in this country within my lifetime, within my kids' lifetime, have and continue to make a big difference. And it's the people who stay in the game, even when policies are not what they want, who have a chance to win. So that's what I'd say, big picture. And I think, and there's a great many opportunities with organizations and even outside of professional organizations to get involved. That's one thing technology has done. It is a lot easier to tell your congressperson what you think than it used to be, no matter what you think, frankly. It's a lot easier to get together and to petition and to connect. That's a benefit of the age we're living in. And it can be an accelerant to getting involved, no matter your age.
David, your work cuts across so much of the environmental movement, from field-wide initiatives to working with cutting-edge interventions to movement building and advocacy. What's inspiring to you right now?
Well, I think, the willingness of the advocates that I know and support and have worked with in different incarnations of my career, their willingness to rethink and their willingness to work in greater collaboration. Like I said, some of the policy shifts that are proposed and are happening are really gutting. But in that is an opportunity. It's a leveling moment, and it's an opportunity to say, what can we do together that we can't do alone? I think that doesn't shift anything overnight, but I think it's such a critical ingredient to the kind of significant social change that we can build. That gives me hope. And the way people are standing up. And I'm not talking about philanthropy, by the way. We're not the ones I'm talking about, but people who are doing the work in communities, even people who are doing the work in national organizations, they're really being attacked. It takes courage to do what they're doing. That I think is inspirational.
Well, a great note to end on. David, as expected, wonderful speaking with you. Thanks for your time and all the best of luck with the work you're doing.
Thank you, Jason. Same to you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Invested in Climate. Please remember to rate us on Apple, Spotify, or Google. Find show notes, sign up for updates, get in touch, and visualize your climate action at investedinclimate.com. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial, accounting, or legal advice. Thanks again.